People rarely lose power all at once. More often, they lose it in tiny, humiliating installments, and the worst part is that the first few payments almost always feel reasonable. That is how manipulation works in professional life. Nobody walks into your office, points at your dignity, and tells you they intend to reduce it. They do it by rearranging the meaning of things. They make exclusion sound strategic. They make dishonesty sound complicated. They make your discomfort sound insecure, your instincts sound reactive, and the private advantage sound like ordinary business. By the time the truth becomes visible, the real damage is not just that you were lied to. It is that someone spent months teaching you to question whether you had the right to notice it. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the office affair, though there was one. Not the politics, though there was plenty of that. What stayed with me was how calmly my boss told me there was nothing going on while building an entire reality around the assumption that I would keep accepting his version of events. He was wrong. Not because I was louder than he expected. Because I was quieter for longer than he understood. My name is Daniel Mercer, and at the time this happened, I was 38 years old and working as senior operations manager for a commercial design firm in Charlotte. We specialized in hospitality interiors, hotels, private clubs, boutique corporate spaces, high-budget renovations for clients who wanted elegance but never wanted to admit how frightened they were of looking ordinary. It was a business built on appearances, which should have made what happened less surprising than it was. In that world, truth is usually the least decorated thing in the room. I had been with the company for almost 7 years. Long enough to know where the bodies were buried, professionally speaking. Long enough to understand which deadlines were real, which promises were theater, which clients needed candor, and which ones needed enough emotional coddling to believe they were the reason the building had standing walls. I was not one of the polished stars. I was not the guy leading champagne toasts after a project closed. I handled the invisible background, procurement schedules, vendor breakdowns, permit sequencing, installation timing, budget bleed, and the thousand ugly little details that determine whether a beautiful presentation ever becomes a functioning space. I liked the kind of work, not because it made me feel important, but because it felt honest. Things either fit or they didn't. Deadlines either held or they collapsed. Material shipped or it didn't. People like to talk about creative energy in industries like ours, but buildings do not stand on energy. They stand on sequence, math, and whether someone in the background is serious enough to care about boring things. My boss was Evan Holloway, the firm's creative director and one of the partners. He was a kind of man who would have been described by most people as magnetic, not handsome in the obvious way, but fluent in confidence. He could enter a room and within 5 minutes make it feel like the conversation had been waiting for him to arrive. Clients loved him. Junior staff admired him. Women tended to lean in when he spoke, and men who cared too much about influence usually mistook him for something deeper than he was. That was part of his power. He knew how to look like vision when other people were doing the engineering underneath him. At first, I respected him. That is one of the harder admissions in any betrayal story. We like to rewrite the past once we have been wounded, as though we saw the person clearly from the beginning and just tolerated them for a while. That wasn't true for me. I respected Evan because he could calm clients, close deals, and protect the firm from the kind of panic that destroys morale. What I didn't fully understand then was that charm and leadership are not the same thing. Charm is often what people use when they need trust faster than character can earn it. I was married once years before the story, but divorced by the time it happened. No children. No dramatic wreckage left behind, just two adults who had slowly become different people and eventually stopped pretending timing was the only problem. That mattered because after the divorce, I had become more cautious with intimacy and more disciplined about work. I poured most of my energy into stability. Long mornings, clean routines, bills paid on time, a condo that stayed in order whether anyone visited or not. Some people called it lonely. I never did. I have always believed solitude is only frightening to people who have built their entire identity around being witnessed. That was one of my blind spots, though I didn't know it yet. Because I was comfortable alone, I assumed I was also protected from certain kinds of manipulation. I thought I would recognize emotional games more quickly than I actually did. But the workplace is its own version of intimacy, and if you spend enough hours inside a hierarchy, trust begins to form in odd places. You start relying on people not because you love them, but because structure demands some version of faith. The first signs were not romantic. They were operational. That matters because this was not a marriage story wearing a blazer. It was a workplace betrayal, and those almost always begin in access before they become personal. Her name was Clay Benton. She was a project coordinator when she joined us, 31, smart, composed, and more competent than the role initially required. She wasn't flashy. That was probably why I liked working with her in the beginning. She asked good questions, remembered details, and did not need everything explained twice. In a business like ours, that qualifies as rare. Over time, she became the person most often attached to Evan's major accounts, which made sense on paper. He was a face. She was organized. I was the operational spine underneath both of them. For the first year or so, our relationship was normal. Friendly, professional, easy. Clay respected process, which already made her more tolerable than half the people in the office. She would stop by my desk to clarify lead times, ask me to pressure a vendor, or quietly confirm whether one of Evan's promised deadlines was actually possible. We had the kind of workplace understanding that comes from sharing reality under someone else's theatrical optimism. Then something shifted. It was gradual enough to make denial easy. Claire started going to meetings she technically didn't need to attend. Evan started bringing her into client dinners that used to be handled by account executives. She became harder to reach in the late afternoon on days when she was supposedly doing local site follow-ups. He began speaking about her with a certain careful casualness, which I noticed more than I wanted to. There is a way people talk about someone when they are trying to normalize a closeness that already feels too warm. They overcorrect toward professionalism. I would hear things like, "Claire's got a good instinct for these clients," or "Claire stayed late and helped me clean up the Marcus account," pitched said in a tone that made the extra mention feel more revealing than the content itself. I noticed, too, that he started excluding me from conversations I used to be central to. Not completely. That would have drawn too much attention. Just enough that I'd receive the summary after the decisions were already socially settled. Enough that I'd be asked to execute things without seeing the messy discussion that created them. That was the first real warning sign, and I missed its deeper meaning because I interpreted it as politics instead of intimacy. That is one of the things I judge in myself now. I was too willing to see ordinary office power games because they felt less humiliating than the truth. It was easier to believe I was being sidelined strategically than to imagine that two people above and beside me were creating a second structure of trust that did not include me. The first direct moment came on a Tuesday evening in late September. We had a hotel installation about to go sideways because a shipment from North Carolina had arrived with a run finish and the client was due on site Thursday morning. I called Claire twice. No answer. I called Evan. He picked up on the third ring, sounding irritated. "Where is Claire?" I asked. There was a pause, then he said, "Why?" "Because she has the vendor notes and I need the revised schedule." "She's tied up." "With what?" Another pause. Then the faintest edge in his tone. "Daniel, do you need something specific or do you want a full map of everyone's evening?" That line stayed with me. Not because it was harsh, because it reframed a necessary question as some kind of social overreach. He was teaching me, in real time, that asking about access carried a penalty. "I need the schedule," I said. "I'll send it." He did 7 minutes later, and the file had clearly been forwarded from her. Nothing about that proves an affair. But this is the problem with intelligent dishonesty. Each moment is built to survive on its own. It only becomes indecent once you line enough of them up and stop apologizing for seeing the pattern. Over the next month, the pattern thickened. Claire's lunch breaks got longer on days Evan had external partner meetings. This tone with me became sharper whenever my questions touched her schedule, even indirectly. She became more guarded around me, not colder exactly, just more curated. That is something people outside these situations often misunderstand. Once guilt enters an ordinary dynamic, people don't always become hostile. Sometimes they become excessively controlled. They begin behaving like every sentence might have to survive future scrutiny. I brought it up once lightly in the supply room while she was checking fabric samples against a manifest. "You and Evan are impossible to pin down lately." She smiled without looking at me. "We've both been slammed, apparently in the same places." That made her look up. It was only a second, but it was enough. Not fear, alertness. Then she laughed softly. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said. "Just noticing." She held my gaze for a moment and said, "You always notice more than most people." At the time, I heard that as a compliment. Later, I realized it sounded more like a warning. The discovery itself did not happen through some dramatic mistake at first. It happened through a child. That is still the detail that disturbs me most, because children do not understand the moral weight of the truths they carry. They simply repeat what was vivid enough to lodge in memory. Evan had a son, Owen, 8 years old, from his first marriage. Owen came by the office a few times a month when Evan had custody, and some scheduling issue forced him to bring the kid in for an hour before pickup. He was a good boy. Quiet, observant, one of those children who seems older than his age because he has already learned how much attention adults reserve for themselves. One Friday afternoon, Owen was sitting on the floor near the resource library drawing on printed paper while I reviewed a shipment discrepancy with Claire. Evan was in a client call down the hall. Claire was distracted, checking her phone too often, which already told me something. Then Owen looked up at her and said, completely casually, "Can I still come to your apartment Sunday, Mom?" The room did not explode. That's the thing. It just changed temperature. Claire went white. I looked at Owen, then at her. He frowned and corrected himself immediately, embarrassed in the reflexive way children get when they sense a tone shift they don't understand. "I mean, Claire." Silence. Then Claire smiled too quickly and said, "That was funny." Funny. I said nothing because the body sometimes understands before the mind decides what kind of damage it is staring at. She kept talking after that, over-explaining some issue with the vendor manifest in a voice that had been artificially bright. Owen went back to drawing, but nothing in that room was normal after that sentence. Children do not randomly substitute mom for a woman who is not structurally close. They do not make that kind of mistake unless some emotional role has already been blurred for them elsewhere. That is what changed the story for me. Not because it confirmed sex, because it confirmed proximity, intimacy, repetition. Enough of both that an 8-year-old had merged identities. I did not confront either of them. Not then. That surprises some people when I tell it. They imagine revelation should immediately become accusation. But accusation is what people do when they still need an answer from the liar. I no longer did. I needed structure, not drama. That evening I stayed late under the pretense of finishing a purchase reconciliation. When the office emptied, I checked the project room calendar logs on our shared system. Evan had blocked out several evening vendor reviews with Claire over the past 8 weeks in time windows that did not match any actual vendor activity. I checked expense submissions. They had filed several local meal reimbursements without client names attached. I checked the security access logs through the facility's dashboard I still had administrative access to from an old renovation project. They had left together after hours more times than either one had reason to. Still not enough. Not for me. So I kept going. The real proof arrived through the work phone archive. Corporate accounts had partial retention enabled, and while direct message content was limited, metadata and attachment histories were not. Claire and Evan were sending each other revised decks renderings and follow-up notes at hours that had nothing to do with work. More importantly, one of the attachments misfiled into a shared archive was not a deck at all. It was a PDF of a private school open house form with Claire listed as emergency pickup for Owen. That was the moment I understood the scale. Affairs are ugly enough. But when someone begins sliding another adult into parental adjacency around a child while the rest of the office is still being fed professional language, that is not confusion anymore. That is moral carelessness. I copied everything I could lawfully access and took screenshots of the rest. Then I sat in my office with the lights off and let the truth settle. It did not feel hot. It felt cold. That matters. I was not thinking about revenge. I was thinking about sequence. About how to move without letting either of them define the meaning of what I already knew. That weekend, I met with a former colleague named Mara who now worked in HR compliance for another firm. I trusted her because she understood both documentation and power. I did not need emotional support. I needed structural advice. After reviewing what I had, she asked, "What do you actually want?" I thought about it for a second and said, "I want the truth to matter more than the confidence." She nodded. "Then don't confront first. Let the structure carry it." That became my method. Over the next 10 days, I documented every task Evan had rerouted through Claire without process approval, every billing discrepancy tied to their after-hours meetings, every account where timeline promises had been altered outside operational review. I was no longer just uncovering an affair. I was mapping the damage created when professional boundaries collapse inside a business built on trust, client discretion, and invisible labor. Because that is the other part people miss. Office affairs between peers are one thing. Affairs tied to hierarchy are something else. They distort decision-making. They alter who gets access, who gets excluded, whose judgment is quietly undermined, and whose work gets used to conceal it. I was not merely a bystander in some tragic romance. I was being operationally displaced by a secret that had already begun affecting the company. The turning point came at a Monday leadership review. Small room. Evan, 2 partners, finance, me, and Claire. We were discussing the Willow Crest Resort install, which had started bleeding money because several procurement decisions had been made out of sequence. I laid out the timeline cleanly. Dates, approvals, change orders, impacts. Then one of the partners, a woman named Rachel Keene, asked the obvious question. Why was procurement bypassed twice on this account? Evan answered immediately. Communication like. That phrase offended me more than it should have, maybe because it was so deliberately bloodless. I said calmly, no. Procurement was bypassed because the sequence was rerouted informally through Claire after hours. The documentation is in the archive. The room went still. Evan turned toward me slowly. What does that mean? He knew what it meant. But arrogant people almost always ask that question first because they still hope tone can delay reality. I slid the printed timeline and attachment log across the table. It means this account and several others stopped following ordinary reporting lines because your relationship with Claire stopped being professional long before either of you adjusted the business structure around it. Claire went completely white. Rachel Keene read the first page, then the second, then looked up with the kind of stillness serious people use when they are already calculating consequence. Another partner, Martin, asked no questions at all, which told me he understood enough immediately. Evan said, "This is wildly inappropriate." I answered, "So is giving one employee unofficial access to decisions that affect billing, staffing, and client exposure because you're sleeping with her. No shouting, no performance. Just language finally stripped of the euphemisms they had been using to keep the company emotionally manageable." Claire started crying quietly. Evan did what men like him always do when the private arrogance becomes public fact. He reached for complexity. "You don't understand the full context." That line almost made me smile. "No," I said. "You lost the right to use context as cover when your son started calling her mom in the office." That was the sentence that ended all maneuvering. Because now it was no longer about flirtation or blurred boundaries or a single lapse in judgment. It was about the scale of the collapse. The room understood that. Rachel closed the folder and said, "I think this meeting is over." It was. The formal investigation took less than 2 weeks. That is what happens when people in power realize the documentation is cleaner than the story they were hoping to tell themselves. Evan was placed on leave first. Claire resigned before the second interview round. The partners hired outside counsel, not because they cared morally more than the average firm, but because liability sharpens ethics very quickly. I was asked, more than once, why I hadn't raised concern sooner. That question interested me because it revealed how companies love documentation after the fact but rarely reward early intuition before it. I answered honestly, because without evidence I would have become the problem faster than they did. That is one of the darker truths about modern workplaces. A calm man noticing something wrong is often treated as political until the file is thick enough to protect the organization from its own denial. I did not celebrate when Evan was terminated. I did not feel vindicated in the simple sense. What I felt was cleaner than that and heavier too. The truth had finally become visible in a room where visibility mattered. Not because I outplayed him. Because he underestimated how much a quiet person can endure while still keeping perfect records. 3 months later, Rachel Keene asked me to step into a newly formalized operations director role. I accepted, but only after making one thing clear: I would not be the silent repairman in a pretty title. Documentation, escalation reporting lines, and after-hours access protocols were going to change. Not because I wanted power, because I had seen what happened when power operates without boundaries and then borrows professionalism from the people it sidelines. The office changed after that. Not morally overnight, of course. Workplaces do not become honest because one scandal gets exposed, but they do become more careful when the cost of arrogance has been made visible. People stopped treating operational process as optional. People became less casual about after-hours access and informal decision-making. More importantly, they stopped assuming quiet men done important. About a year later, I ran into Owen with his mother at a bookstore downtown. He recognized me first and waved. His mother thanked me awkwardly but sincerely for always being kind to him in the office. I told her he was a good kid. She looked like she wanted to say more, but didn't, and I was grateful for that. Not every wound needs another conversation draped over it. If you ask me now what the story means, I would say this: underestimation is not just an error in judgment. It is often a confession. It tells you what kind of intelligence the other person respects and what kind they ignore until it becomes dangerous to ignore. Evan thought I was useful but secondary. He thought because I cleaned up his mistakes quietly, I would never become the person who preserved them accurately enough to expose him. Claire thought the office would keep reading me as the stable operational man in the background, not the one paying closest attention. They were both wrong in the same way. They mistook composure for irrelevance. That is why I tell the story this way. Not as revenge, not as triumph, but as instruction. If you are the quiet person in the room, do not assume people see your value just because they benefit from it. And if you are carrying more truth in the room currently wants, keep your records. Not to destroy anyone, to protect reality from people who believe confidence can override sequence, evidence, and consequence. Arrogance rarely fails because someone shouts louder than it does. It fails when the least dramatic person in the room decides the truth deserves a file. Tom T-Led-1-EAFT Mo T-Led-1-EA3. In this emotional long-form narrated life story, a quiet operations manager slowly realizes that something inappropriate is happening between his boss and a colleague, and that the betrayal is affecting far more than personal trust. What begins as small inconsistencies, after-hours access, shifting authority, and subtle exclusion gradually becomes a deeper story of workplace arrogance, manipulation, power imbalance, and hidden professional damage. As overlooked details, office records, childlike honesty, and carefully documented evidence begin to connect, the truth becomes impossible to hide. This is not a revenge story. It is a reflective, psychologically sharp life story about office betrayal, leadership failure, silence, underestimation, and the quiet strength of a man who refuses to let confidence outrun reality. If you enjoy mature narrated stories about workplace politics, hidden affairs, professional power dynamics, and calm personal strength, this story delivers tension, insight, and a powerful message about how truth is finally revealed.